Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about the topic that's of great interest to me. I've had a wonderful semester this year learning about the professions, the information science, the arts of being able to provide information, organize information. And the thing that really brought me to this was wanting to see the role of the oral historian and how that fit in with the archivist. So let's get started. So, who are you? What is your passion? I wanted to compare and kind of contrast what I knew about historians. They capture information. How do they manage information? How do they store it? How do they preserve it? How do they deliver the message? And then I kind of lined that up with the archivists. How do they capture information, manage it, store it, preserve it, deliver the information to the patron? I began to see that there were a lot of similarities. And when you have the perspective of being a historian, especially an oral historian, you can see how the collection of that information and searching out of that information would be really important for you. When we looked at the ways in which so many librarians and archivists are drawn, I wonder what that connection was between the historian and those who want to preserve those stories. So where did I begin? I began to think about acknowledging two things: acknowledging time and acknowledging place. The dates. What's the framework that I wanted to look at? Was it 50 years ago, 25 years ago, last week, 100 years ago? What was going on in that time? What was the context? Who was with you? When you think about people telling a story, who told you? How did you come to know the things that you know and the people that you know? And then think about what happened in that place. What were some of the factors? How was the past related to the future? Who told you? How did you come to know things about the place you occupied? So those critical things about the storyteller, the person who's narrating the story, I really wanted to get a sense of who that was and acknowledging the time and the place. For me, I chose at the time a Jubilee year, a 50th anniversary. What was a special anniversary of an event? Looking back, looking forward, how did other people celebrate that time? What kind of milestone was that in someone's life? And I asked them to begin to think about it. If I was going to be the listener, if I was going to archive the material, that's what I began to looking for. What was that special event? And in my own life, I began to look at that Jubilee year, that 50th celebration of both high school and college, and how that point in time allowed people to tell their story, to reminisce, but also think about 50 years is a long time. And would they remember? What did they remember? What were the points that they thought were really important? So what excites you? What are those different stages, different seasons? What are the points of transition in your life? Were there external factors that were going on? A war, a move, something totally outside of your control? Or was there something else? Did you have a period of time where you were just feeling lots of changes and emotions in your life? What can you do to contribute something good? How do your stories, your memories, how does inquiring of someone else, their stories and memories, how does that contribute to the good? Is it something that you can't find in a book? It's not in an article. It's not the person that would have written a newspaper article, a famous person that would have been published, but maybe their story might have meaning for you personally, for a wider community, or maybe you'd like to preserve a life or an event that otherwise you would not know anything about. How do you bring it all together? That's the creative part. What's your way of looking at the story? As an oral historian, painting the picture and telling the story, you can do that for someone else, but wouldn't it be interesting to hear the narrator, that first person, that primary resource, tell about their experience of working on a train or being at a particular place at time, and how if you don't have that person's voice, you might not ever know from the perspective of the person who experienced it. So think about how you develop as a professional. What are some of the things that you can do to help you develop as an archivist, as an oral historian? First thing you might want to do is update your resume. Think creatively and have some confidence. Maybe you've never done this work before, but you're learning about all of the different factors that have affected people when they've made choices about being an archivist, a librarian. So update your resume. Pull together some of the things that you've learned from this course. What are the skill sets that you have that you think would be an attractive candidate? Update your profile. Many of us subscribe to different formats. There's so many different internet, Indeed, LinkedIn. Take a look at your profile. See how someone might view you. Google yourself. See what comes up. Update your brand. Dream really big. How would you like to be seen in the marketplace? What type of professional would you like to be? Watch the trends, but know what is important to you. What are the skill set that you bring to the table? One of the things that I learned is that I really was a good listener, and that people found it easy to talk to me. And a lot of times people would say, you know what, no one has ever asked me that question before. I never thought about it that way. And then give the person a chance, an opportunity to share part of their story. Know your own story. Know what some of the things that have been important in your life that have motivated you. Get in the practice of listening to stories of others, especially people that you don't know very much about. Again, reading a book, reading something in the paper, hearing a twit, a snippet of someone else is very different than listening to someone who is actually experiencing a life event or something that they're going through. So what did I do? I really began, because I love books, is to start with a bibliography, to read everything that I could, gather all the information. And then I would tell my own story, my own relationship, as a way to humanize what's going on, but also as a way to get some experience with how difficult it is to share your story or to even think about things in a different way. It sensitized me. It gave me a great deal of empathy to listening to other people. And then offer to listen to others. Offer to give people an opportunity to share what's important to them. It doesn't mean you quiz them with 5,000 interview questions, but you do give people some space and some chances, very often open-ended questions. You don't have to have a particular incentive in mind. In fact, people really really want to be listening to. If you say to somebody, I'm writing a paper, or I'm going to get my doctorate, or I'm doing this research, it puts the person in a very different mindset than knowing a little bit about you and why you're curious about some aspect of their lives. Keeping in mind that not everybody wants to talk to everybody, but everyone has the ability, has a willingness to want to share. Maybe if they think someone cares or they think someone wants to listen. Correct the doubts and connect the dots. Try to realize that when someone tells you their story, that first person narrative, they're looking at it from their perspective, but maybe you as an archivist and you as the collector of the story, or the person who's writing the story down, the scribe, you have such a unique opportunity to connect their story to other activities that are going on in the world, in their community. Oftentimes people are not aware of other factors, but you can be aware of it. That's how your role as an archivist and an oral historian comes in. You don't have to interpret what the person is saying, but having a sense of context and place and time is very, very helpful. Go back to school. That's what I did. I realized that there were lots of things that I knew. In some ways, I was a subject matter expert in some areas, but there were other areas that I didn't know anything about. I wanted to learn more about preserving materials. I wanted to learn about the legal aspects. I wanted to be able to conserve stories, preserve stories, but I also wanted to collect stories from people who we haven't heard from, people who might benefit from hearing from other people, and being in an academic environment, being in a place where I could meet other professionals, meet other people who did oral stories, look at maybe what's been done historically, WPA, during that time of our country where the policies, the president wanted to get people back to work. Many writers and artists and editors and anthropologists got a chance to go out and collect stories. But we know today that many of the people that collected the stories didn't necessarily share the stories. We don't always have written transcripts. The people who told the stories didn't know how their stories were going to be used, and many of them never saw the actual documents, nor did they really know the people who they spoke to. So these were some issues that were very important that we wanted to be able to look to the future to say, how could we do it differently? And then for me, that final thing was begin to hang out with the folks who shared my interests. Spend time at organizations, associations, oral history association, attending conferences, reading books, going to local gatherings, any opportunity that I had to meet with people. Oftentimes people were interested in oral history or archiving material, or people who like to make films. There's a particular media that they like to work in. So these were all ways that I made a conscious effort to begin to think about the development that I wanted to have to be both an oral historian and an archivist. So I want to tell you a little bit about a case study. I had the opportunity to work with my high school, my 50th reunion year. I had attended a public high school in New York, and that was a special high school where people came. We were all girls high school, same sex, and you started in the 7th grade and you went to the 12th grade. So It was kind of a small group where young women really got a chance to know one another. The school is no longer the same sex, it's co ed. There's lots of things that have changed in the city, but I wanted to look at that and look at the ways in which our class, and that was a class of 1971, had changed. I also developed this idea of being an oral historian, being a scribe, establishing ways to engage alumni and engage people to tell their stories, to reminisce, to recollect. Some people see this engagement as a way to raise money. My thought was many people wanted to connect, particularly around the time of the pandemic, and this was a way to reach out. So, having an alumni engagement event, developing a bibliography about the time, and then building my skills by clarifying my values about oral history was really important. Purple threads was a concept that actually another classmate had, where he wanted to look at, in my college 50th reunion, as we planned for that, how were people connected to one another? What social events, what historical events, what key moments in American history would be affected? And he called those purple threads. And how do we weave our purple thread? And it looked like a really good way to get people interested in talking, bridging the divide that many people have. I don't have anything in common, I'm not successful, but to begin to talk about the ways in which they did share things in common. And we built from there. What would you do for free? Close your eyes for a minute and just think about, what is it about the profession that draws you in? And when I began to do that for myself, I realized that I really did love talking to people, listening to people, and having those voices, those unspoken voices, those voices that were not at the table, giving them a chance to give life to their voice, looking at how unspoken voices can change society, influence society. And I would do that for free. It's something that I felt very attuned to. And a lot of it had to do with my love of books and my love of reading and my love of hearing stories, being read to, reading to other people. That love of literature, the love of storytelling, and the love of stories, and wanting to preserve not just the story, but the experience of telling the story, particularly with traditions that didn't have a long history of writing things down, or on topics that I don't want to say were taboo, but less tolerance, less willingness to hear stories that weren't already published, weren't already developed. What do we know about different groups in society where we don't have an official public record? There isn't an article in the paper. If you Google that person, their name or their story is not going to pop up. But if we collect those stories and we honor those people, how much does that encourage the person who tells the story to not just share the story for someone else, but is there value in you telling your own story and deciding for yourself that that story is something that may provide support to other people, may heal, and change your view of something that happened. And then for me, I realized that as I began to collect stories, and I had quite a few stories, it just seemed to snowball, that if I really was going to be a good steward of the stories that I had, I needed to take a records inventory. I needed to make a list, an inventory of each of the records, and look at where they came from, how long it was, how might I organize my own collection, how could I preserve and figure out a way to honor the people who had shared their stories with me. But if there was a Jackie collection, how did I want to see it handled? When I offered people the opportunity to tell their story, I did not ask them to be compensated. I did not pressure them to share what they wanted to do with their story. We talked about the activity of storytelling and oral history, and that they would get a chance to look at the material. They would get a transcript. They would get a video if they had chose to film it, or they would get an audio tape, and then just sit with it a while. And I realized as I began to collect different stories, those stories were defining and broadening a collection. And then the idea of what type of information professional would I be, what would I do with those stories, how would I manage it, what were the ethical and the moral things to do when I shared a story with someone, and did not at the same time discuss how I would keep it, what was the best way to preserve it. So developing a model and using the tools that I learned as the archivist to manage those records. What do I have? What do I need? What's missing? Looking at a body of work in a collection was really a very important step for me in my own process. And going back to capturing, managing, storing, preserving, and delivering, I looked at a plan for how I wanted to do that, and then what action. How would I obtain stories? How would I solicit information? How did I want to organize it? As I spoke about that records management, how did I want to store it? Was I prepared to store an expanding digital collection of my own, and what kind of suggestions would I have for a narrator about how they might want to store it? Preserving the stories and finding aids in developing that skill so that these stories that would be preserved, whether they're my collection when I had permission to share, or how would I help a person who told a story who may not realize that 25 years, 50 years, 100 years from now, someone would value that story? How would they provide access for someone that they would never know, but for whom the telling of their story and the keeping of the record, the development of the record might be of historical significance somewhere down the road or at a particular place in time? How might they find that? Who might find that of interest? And then would they want to share it with others? There are some restrictions. One of my teachers, I actually majored in American civilization, was very good at record keeping, but also very good at providing comfortable ways for people to put restrictions on their stories. When I looked at his own body of work, historian that was my teacher, many things were collected and organized, correspondence, dates, times, but he also had a body of work that was restricted. Some of the restrictions had to do with time. 50 years after this date, I was looking at a special collection that he did, and the box was labeled. I remember it was box number 35 of many, many boxes, and it said in box 35, this material is restricted, and it was preserved. There may have been other limitations that were part of the collection when he donated that, or when it was donated to the repository. But there was also some other materials, as he said, by April 2021, which had been 50 years after the documents had been donated, the restriction would be lifted, and the public, researchers who might have interest in what was in the box, could look at it after a particular date. What are your interests and your ideas? And I think that when you're an oral historian, having an idea about something that you find fascinating, again, for the look back for me, when I look back on 50 years of going to school, celebrating these milestones of graduation, I realized that I had several interests. I was very interested in special collections. I was interested in American civilization, social history, interdisciplinary studies, that I had done many things, but I was often an educator, a storyteller, a purveyor of information, packaging information in a way, whether it was health information, information about how to do things, maybe ways to be creative and artistic, but ways in which I would be an educator, that I would want to motivate and inspire other people to learn more and do more, and to have some discernment about the information that they had. I had a particular penchant for oral history, voices not heard. I didn't realize that perhaps because of when I went to school and many themes around that, I was very interested in the history of higher education, in the history of higher education that had to do with Black people, Native Americans, immigrants. How did our culture treat people who had interests in education, and particularly the history of education, granting degrees, subjects that they were interested in, financing public education, financing private education. I was really interested in all of that subject matter, and until I looked at the body of work and my interests, I never realized that before. Records management and alumni engagement were the issues that came up for me. I really want to thank you all for listening. I've talked a little bit about my own personal development, but most importantly, I wanted to share with you that the idea of being an information professional is something that will change and evolve over time, hopefully for all of you, no matter where you are in your career journey. And thanks for letting me listen in on those big ideas and those visions. If you have any questions, please feel free to give me an email, shout out. I have missed seeing you all in class, but I think that this is a great opportunity as we wind up these 15, 16 weeks to connect. I did include a bibliography of some of the things that I've been working on. Some of the topics may seem obscure, but what I have learned is that I love to learn more about the Archivist and the oral historian that inspire me. So I have been enjoying biographies. I have been learning more about bibliophiles, people who collect books, and I've been learning more about the role of the oral historians. And I have quite a bibliography that's building, And there are librarians and archivists and information professionals that have specialized in bibliographies, and I think it's a great field, and I would like to meet more of those people. So thank you, and have a great, great life ahead.